I've studied quite a few languages in depth, the most recent being Tibetan, which I started within the last few weeks over a break that ended up being a lot longer than expected. When I started studying Tibetan, one of the things I was most excited by was the set of evidential moods, as I'd never studied a language with such a rich evidential system before. If you don't know what that means, stay put, I'll explain it later. The point is, even as I was looking forward to the complexity of the evidential system, I was surprised by how simple in theory it was, while still managing to pervade the language and make it feel unique. I thought then that it would be a great topic for a YouTube video, as it's a very interesting and beautiful system, yet one that is intuitive enough to be understood easily even by people only passingly interested in Tibetan or languages in general. I looked around for a bit for a video or writing on the subject beyond a surface level in a format more approachable than a reference grammar, and I couldn't find much, so I figured I'd try my hand at making a video about it myself. So, in short, the purpose of this video is to give you an intuitive sense of how evidentials in Tibetan work, and with that a sense of what it feels like to use and interact with the Tibetan language. I would like to preface the meat of the video by saying that I'm not a native speaker of Tibetan, and further, I'm not even good at Tibetan. Most of the examples sentences are from Tournadre's Manual of Standard Tibetan, and the others I simply made up myself. Thus it's possible that there could be some smaller mistakes or unnatural speech. If you know Tibetan better than me, feel free to correct me and I'll pin your comment or add notes or whatever I can do to avoid blatantly misinforming the masses. A final note before we get started. Keep in mind Tibetan uses traditional spelling, which means that how words are spelled no longer matches up completely with how they are pronounced due to the evolution of the Tibetan language over the last 1,000 years. The most common romanization system for Tibetan, the Wiley system, which I'm going to be using in this video, prioritizes mimicking the now strange-seeming Tibetan spelling over making phonetic sense to someone familiar with the Latin alphabet. What this essentially means is that there are going to be a bunch of silent letters in the examples given, and tones and voicing of certain consonants will pop in out of nowhere. I don't think that it's worth it to try to clarify this system, as I'm not familiar with another romanization system, and I just don't think it's important for this video to have the examples phonetically written out. It's not meant to teach you the language, and there are many works that you can read if you want to get a hold on the Tibetan alphabet. Just be warned. So I'll start at the informative part of the video with a very quick primer on what an evidential system is. Evidentiality in linguistics is the grammatical indication of the source of the information contained in some sentence. One of the most well-known examples of a language carrying evidentials is the Turkish language, which distinguishes direct information, which is reported directly by the speaker, from indirect information, which is relayed through some secondary source. So the sentence, "someone killed the king," would be said differently depending on whether the speaker were a direct witness to this tragedy or if he was told on the street after the fact. There are more evidential categories than this in Tibetan, but before I explain it in detail, I'm going to talk about copulas for a bit. In Tibetan, there are many copulas that carry evidential meanings. A copula is just a word, and in the case of English and Tibetan, a verb form that links the subject to a subject complement, which is a phrase that either renames or describes the subject. Put simply, a copula is an analog of the English verb to be in the sentences "the man is a doctor," or "the car is red," or "he is in Tibet." But to understand the copulas of Tibetan, before we even go into evidentiality, it's necessary to understand how the specific meaning of "to be" differs in the above sentences. "The man is a doctor" or "the car is red" are both equating the subject with something, either a noun or an adjective, while "he is in Tibet" conveys a sense of existence rather than some intrinsic property of the man in question. While in English these two ideas all fall under one verb, "to be," in Tibetan there are two classes of copulas, essential copulas and existential copulas. Essential copulas govern the essence of the subject. For example, the sentence "the man is a doctor" is equating the man with a doctor. The man thus has the essential property of doctor. Similarly, we can say that some car has the essence of red, whereas "he is in Tibet" is not a property of him. He could move to any number of locations and still be the same old guy. The sentence is rather concerned with the existence of this guy, and "in Tibet" just happens to be the location of said existence. Such ideas in Tibetan are governed by the existential copulas. Note that in Tibetan, sentences of possession also use existential copula. For example, to say "he has many books," you literally say "many books exist to him," using an oblique case. It's not super important as far as this video is concerned to clearly understand the difference between these two ideas, as I wanted to focus more on the evidential moods of Tibetan, but at the very least just know that there will typically be an essential and existential version of any given copula meaning. So it should be clear from this slide that re is an essential copula, but note that there are actually two existential copulas used on the right. This brings us to an actual discussion about how the evidential system of Tibetan works. In the sentence, he is in Tibet, the copula yo re is used, while in the sentence, he has many books, the copula du is used. The reason, as you probably guessed by now, is that Tibetan copulas do not only distinguish between existential and essential meanings, but also between evidential meanings. Again, this means that copula used gives some information about the source of the information conveyed. So yo re is the assertive essential copula, and du is the testimonial essential copula. So now I'll go into an explanation about what that means. In Tibetan, as far as the basic copulas are concerned, there are three evidentials: the assertive, the testimonial, and the egophoric. There is a fourth evidential, the inferential, which is not used with state of being copula, but does appear as a perfect auxiliary verb, which we'll discuss later. So I'll explain these four evidential categories of Tibetan with some examples first. The assertive implies that the information presented is a specific fact or a general truth. It is considered to be certainly true by the speaker, but there's no implication that the speaker has witnessed the conveyed information. According to some analyses of the language, this has been described as a neutral evidential, as even directly reported information, which would normally be conveyed through the testimonial mood, can sometimes be stated in the assertive to stress its essential truth. In the sentence, he is a doctor, his doctoral essence is not to be questioned, and as you can see, re is the assertive essential copula. Now I can also use the assertive essential copula yo re to say he has many books, and in this sentence I haven't necessarily seen these books, but it is certainly true that many books exist in his general direction. But I can now switch out the existential assertive copula for the existential testimonial copula du to say he has many books with the testimonial mood. The sentence now implies that I have seen his books and I'm directly reporting this sighting to my listeners. Note that there is no essential testimonial copula, rather instead there is a similar but slightly different revelatory essential copula. Don't worry about what this means, I'm essentially going to ignore this copula for the purposes of this video, so you can too. Just rejoice that there is one less example on the bottom row for me to butcher. Moving on, the egophoric evidential implies personal knowledge or intention on the part of the speaker. Now, the egophoric evidential category is a bit more unique to Tibetan, and it's a more broad category than the others. There are actually many egophoric auxiliaries and meanings that I will not cover in this video. But it is important to understand the idea that often what may be testimonial when talking about other people ends up being egophoric when it is used in the first person. For example, to a Tibetan, the idea that you have witnessed that he has many books is very simple, but the idea that you have witnessed your own ownership of books does not make much sense. Rather, you are claiming it from your own self. So while the third person, he has many books, is often perfectly natural to say using the testimonial, the first person, I have many books, is much more natural to be said egophoric. Similarly, if you say, I am fine, it's less about experiencing or witnessing a sense of fine, although you can sometimes use the testimonial with mental or physical feelings to denote some specific meanings that I don't have the time to cover. It's more natural to claim through your own ego that you are okay, and thus use the egophoric. But you can also use the egophoric copulas in non-first person situations to make claims about the world. A very interesting example is if I say, this is your tea, using an egophoric yin, it is not your tea because the tea has the property of being yours, as would be true if perhaps you made it for yourself, and it's not because I saw or witnessed you drinking the tea. Rather, I'm claiming from my own self that it is your tea, and thus it carries an implication that I am offering you a lovely pot of tea. The inferential evidential is not associated with any simple copula, but I'll quickly go over what it means. This mood implies that the information conveyed by the speaker was deduced from past actions or present circumstances. For example, if you wake up in the morning and notice that there is snow on the ground, you could say it snowed overnight because even though you are not a witness to the snow falling, you can assume that it did due to the present remnants of that action. Or you can say my boss isn't here if you notice that their car is not in the normal parking space and deduce that they must be elsewhere. Here's a quick review slide of the copulas. On their own, these copulas make sentences regarding state of being much more specific than they would be in a language with no evidential distinctions, and this is certainly interesting. But what really transforms these copulas from something interesting and fun into something that seems to dominate the language as a whole is the fact that these copulas are not only used in standard state of being expressions, rather they, along with many other verbs, are regularly used as auxiliary verbs in sentences with any main verb as the standard way to indicate tense aspect. For example, the present tense is formed by using the particle ki with any existential copula. So if we take the same existential copulas from the sentence he is in Tibet and combine it with the verb to stay, which does not change its form for tense aspect, we can get the form for he is staying. Note that this also can mean he was staying in the past imperfective or he stays, depending on the context. But now, if instead we use the testimonial existential du, we get the same tense aspect with a testimonial rather than an assertive mood, implying that you know he is staying in Tibet specifically because you saw him in Tibet. As I mentioned before, the egophoric mood is a bit different, and it would be strange to claim from your own ego the whereabouts of someone else, but it is perfectly natural to use the egophoric existential yo to make a claim about yourself as follows. Interestingly enough, because of the tendency for the egophoric to be used in the first person where other moods would be used for the second and third person, people at one point analyzed it incorrectly as a first-person conjugation rather than an evidential mood, but we saw from that T example that this is not the case. But of course we can do this with any verb. We can, for example, say he is writing a letter, or any number of things using these three evidentials. Now, you might be wondering what happens if we use the essential instead of existential copulas at the end of these sentences after the particle ki. This is actually how the future tense is formed in the assertive, so we can say I will be staying in Tibet, and in the egophoric as well. But note that the revelatory essential copula cannot be used in this way, leaving no room in the future tense for a testimonial evidential. And this actually makes complete sense. You cannot use the testimonial evidential in the future because obviously you cannot witness future events. Such a construction would be illogical. This is a great example of how mood does not always play well with tense aspect. So of course, after covering the future and present tenses, it makes sense to move on to the past tense, and there's little new here. For the past perfective tense in the egophoric and assertive evidentials, it's formed exactly like the future tense, but with the particle pa instead of ki. So we can say I stayed in Tibet using the perfective aspect in the egophoric and assertive moods just fine. The same is almost true for the verb to write, but the verb changes form slightly for the past tense as some verbs do. Don't worry about it. For the testimonial, it's a bit different. We use the auxiliary verb song without any nominalizing particle following the verb. The reason we don't use the testimonial essential state of being is that we don't actually have one. As I said before, we have a revelatory, which is not exactly what we want. The important thing is we use song instead. Now at this point I've introduced some heavy machinery, and it really pays off to take a step back and consider what we are actually doing here. This idea of using auxiliary verbs, or as they're often called in English primary schools, helping verbs, to affect the tense aspect and or mood of a main verb is not completely foreign to English. Think about the sentences I am going to the store, or I have been watching TV, or I will save myself. First, I would like to point out that often the use of auxiliary verbs makes logical sense. Consider grammatically the English progressive aspect sentence, I'm going to the store. Logically, going in this sentence functions as a modifier, an adjective of sorts, and the copula to be is just equating those two. I am going. I have the property of going. As it turns out, in Tibetan, the previously discussed particles pa and ki, used with the copulas and other auxiliaries to create past, present, and future tenses, are particles with meanings outside of these verb conjugations. In particular, pa is a nominalizer associated with the past tense, so the sentence below makes sense in a similar literal way to the English, I am going to the store. It can be literally thought of to mean that thing where he wrote a letter is, as pa turns the verb phrase he writes a letter into a noun associated with the past tense, and then re just acts as an assertive copula. Note that it is actually an essential rather than an existential copula, so this literal translation is not perfect, but I still think it helps to provide some logic to the grammar that we're seeing. Now let's finish out the basic tense aspect combos with the Tibetan perfect tense. This denotes a past action that still applies to the present. For example, in English, I have made dinner implies that I am done making dinner, but my making of dinner applies to the present in that presumably it's ready to eat. This works exactly the same way in Tibetan as it does in English, with the sentence, I have prepared food. So the difference between these new perfect sentences and the last slide of past perfective sentences would be approximated by the differences between the English sentences, I made dinner and I have made dinner. We can use this to say that he has stayed in Tibet with an inferential auxiliary. Perhaps you noticed that someone speaks fluent Tibetan and so you can infer that they are from Tibet. Or perhaps you read a letter that your friend has written, but you did not actually see him writing this letter. In this case, you could say that he has written a letter using the inferential auxiliary. You have inferred that he wrote a letter from the present results of his past action. So let's take one final step back and wrap up the video. First, the 6 copula were introduced and separated into groups of essential, existential, and into the evidential categories of assertive, testimonial, or egophoric, or more accurately, 5 of them were treated as such and the revelatory existential copula was heartlessly ignored. Then we looked at how these copulas, along with a couple auxiliary verbs, can be used in conjunction with the nominalizers pa and ki to form a rich system of tense aspect mood distinctions. While the 4 evidentials of Tibetan may seem very intimidating on paper, the idea that 5 copulas carrying evidential meanings are used as verb final suffixes in such a cookie-cutter way to carry the brunt of this system is a very simple and beautifully intuitive way for the language to have come together, and this is what initially inspired me to make this video. There are certainly more evidential implying tense requiring auxiliary verbs in Tibetan, and there were a few that I was planning to cover in this video before it got more dense than I liked, but I hope I was able to convey to you a bit of what makes this system so appealing to me. Okay, so obviously this was my first video, and I would definitely appreciate some feedback. Initially I was planning on stockpiling 1 or 2 more videos about Tibetan as well as some other languages I am much more familiar with before posting this one, but this video ended up being quite a bit more dense than I thought it would be, and it also took a lot longer to make than I was expecting, so I'd really like to get some feedback on this video before potentially starting another. My main concern is whether this was understandable to people with no background in Tibetan. Of course, I'm assuming some level of familiarity with some basic linguistic concepts like cases and auxiliary constructions and stuff, but my hope was that this would be understandable to people with no background in linguistics or Tibetan. After finishing this video, I'm not so sure about that, so I figured I'd post it and see what people say. So if this stopped making sense 2 minutes in, then let me know, and if you were able to get something out of this video despite a relative lack of prior exposure to Tibetan, let me know that as well. And of course, if you have any questions or corrections, I'll make myself available in the comments to respond to those. And of course, if you want to see more videos like this, then you should like this video or even tell me what kind of videos you would like to see or what you'd like to see me change.